My name is Vicki Daniel. I am a teaching fellow and a lecturer at Case Western Reserve University, and I am the chair for this panel today, Death at the Intersection, Selling, Investigating, and Processing Death in 19th and 20th Century America. Now, that really expansive title for our panel today is there because I think we have a range of really exciting papers that I put together with my co-panelists. And like many of you, we were really sorry to not be in Seattle earlier this month to be able to present that at the American Historical Association more formally. But we are very grateful to have this opportunity to do a virtual AHA panel. And we want to thank you all for being here today and watching along with us. I also want to quickly acknowledge that we are doing this panel just shortly after the United States has crossed the threshold of losing over 400,000 people to the COVID pandemic. And I think I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, certainly none of us who work in death studies or the history of death ever want our work to feel as relevant as I think it does right now sometimes. And I'd like to just take that moment to acknowledge the loss of those over 400,000 lives and to recognize that those lives had value and to go forward with that acknowledgement and that awareness of the context in which we're speaking today. Now, for our panel today, our format is going to be slightly different than a traditional panel at a conference. We have agreed to do slightly shortened versions of our talks. So we'll speak for between 10 and 15 minutes each. We will then also do those talks consecutively. So we'll do those, is that the right word? Sequentially. We'll do them one right after the other, holding the questions until the very end of our session today. If, however, during someone's presentation, a question occurs to you and you don't want to lose track of it, you're more than welcome to put that question down into the chat feature today, and we'll make sure that we get to those when we do start the Q&A session at the end of our presentations today. So without further ado, I'm going to start us off by introducing our first panelist for today. This is Lisa Caitlin Highsmith. Lisa is a doctoral candidate at Kansas State University, where she studies the commercialization of death in 19th century America, spiritualism, as well as the role of print media in the emerging funeral industry. Her talk today is titled Mourning Edition, the Spiritualist Marketing Strategy to Combat Bad Death in the Banner of Light. And Lisa, you should be able to share your presentation now.
Yes, thank you for that lovely introduction. Give me one moment while I bring up this PowerPoint for you all. All right, so that should be set up so that everyone can see. So again, my name is Lisa Highsmith, and thank you so much for joining us for this Death Studies panel at the virtual AHA. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Now, 19th century America was no stranger to death and dying. However, the Civil War and its associated high mortality rate placed discussions of the afterlife, typically a personal matter, into the public sphere. During this time of religious and political distress, the spiritualist movement provides an interesting angle to explore American death culture. While the nation was in many ways disjointed, the spiritual movement crossed lines of gender, race, and social status. And as mourning became a public spectacle in the latter portion of the century, it also became commercialized, with print media being the primary way of dispersing information to its targeted consumer. Oh, and my PowerPoint went away. There we go.
It's the spirits. I always tell people.
Here we go. Yes, it's the spirits. So when we typically think about death in the 19th century, two authors often come to mind, or at least they do for me, Philip Arias and Drew Gilpin Faust. Now, Philip Arias in his book Western Attitudes Towards Death, From the Middle Ages to the Present, is considered by many to be the foundation for understanding death and dying in a Western context. Although he's not the first or only author to do so, and of course has issues with its generalizations and Anglo-centric narrative. For the sake of my presentation, I'm only referring to his thy death paradigm.
Lisa, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but your PowerPoint didn't come back onto the screen after that glitch. So if you could try to reshare, that'd be great.
Did it not? Here. Let me do it like this. Yes, and always feel free to interrupt me if something doesn't work. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And whoops. Okay, so getting back on topic then, according to Arias, as the nuclear family became more commonplace and several generations of a family cohabitated and got to spend time with one another, death culture shifted to making sure that loved ones became the focus of secular and religious rituals. Loved ones were expected to have what we consider to be a good death and to be properly memorialized. The establishment of modern cemeteries that are well tended to and beautiful to look at is one such example. One of the most important aspects of a good death that Gilbert Faust describes in her work is the ability to die surrounded by loved ones, and that the dying had a chance to say their goodbyes to those close to them. Now, this, of course, is impossible given the circumstances during the war. Many soldiers had a bad death and died in anonymity on the battlefield. Through the work of Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, and others, the reality of war came home in October of 1862 when the Dead of Antietam photography exhibit opened in his New York gallery. So keeping all this in mind, the living searched for ways to make the dead have, in some form or another, an adequate passing or death. Techniques like embalming, photography, and the popularity of the spiritualist movement allowed the populace to try and hold on to their loved ones just a little while longer, or at least put them in a recognizable state. On the one hand, this allowed the populace to share the grief of their collective losses. Still, it also brought with it the commercialization and professionalization of what would become the American funeral industry. In brief, spiritualism is based on the belief that deceased persons, through the use of mediums, could interact and communicate with the living. And although not a formalized religious institution, spiritualist thought was widely disseminated to the American populace through newspapers such as the Banner of Light. Now, while on the surface this sounds like a mentality that would be on the fringe of polite society, that is not the case. It even made its way into the White House via Abraham Lincoln's wife. The ability to hear voices of the dead or religious entities, especially saints, is nothing new in Western Christianity and made perfect logical sense to people as science and medicine further explored what the human body was capable of. The use of media, or print media especially, to sell ideas and products was not new to those living in the 19th century either. The Second Great Awakening, starting in the 1790s, found great success with the incorporation of lectures and testimonials and sermons in a printed medium. This allowed for a larger portion of the population to be exposed to ideas and products originally only available to them if they attended a revival meeting in person. So by the time the Banner of Light, the newspaper I will be discussing today, was first published in 1857, the process had already been ingrained into American society. Now, those of you familiar with American death studies might be asking yourself, Lisa, the funeral industry doesn't really take root until around the 1880s. Why start looking now? It is precisely that lack of an established funeral industry that gave spiritualists an opportunity to try, and in many ways fail, to claim this niche market. Spiritualists took to position themselves as the authority on death, dying, in the afterlife in their lectures and publications. And I want to see if some early sellers of death goods, photos, headstones, etc., took advantage of this opportunity to introduce their wares to an audience so fixated on the afterlife. The periodical known as the Banner of Light was a weekly publication from Boston, Massachusetts that dates from 1857 to 1907, making it the longest running spiritualist newspaper in America. Now, this provides a unique opportunity to explore the development of the movement and the death culture it is associated with in a pre-war, active war, and post-war context. Although this presentation will only be able to cover the period from 1857 to 1865. Interestingly, the newspaper was originally meant to be a literary magazine of general information that only had spiritualist content in a section devoted to Mrs. J.H. Conant's medium findings. You can see a picture of her here. However, by the third publication, it was clear that it was the spiritualist content that the public craved, and the paper began to cater to this audience in particular. But let's get into some specifics of what I found in the advertisements section. In 1857, again, it's published in Boston, and although it does have ads from other states, particularly New York, it is mostly localized to the Boston area. It also leans heavily into its role as a literary magazine, having most of its advertisements focus on books and pamphlet publications, globes, and the occasional medium. The other main advertisement is either dentists or people in places of healing. Now, this is a trend that will continue throughout the years I've studied so far. This year had 781 ads placed, although it should be noted that circulation began in April, not in January, as all of the other years do. Much the same can be said for 1859. However, there is a major shift in terms of publishing. The Banner is now published in both Boston and New York. There are several reasons for this, but the two most important being that Boston and New York were where most of their support was, and by their own admission that they're barely cutting printing costs. So they changed the way that ads were reserved by line, not by block. And this move to include New York and this new way of selling ads seems to work. I've counted in 1,718 ads in 1859. That's almost 1,000 more than the previous year. That is not to say they didn't run into some issues though, mainly concerning the supposed mediums and healing tonics. The popular adage of "do not believe everything you read" rings true in this situation, as the Banner of Light is somewhat notorious for allowing proven frauds to place ads in the paper, leading to them to publish this notice on July 30th, 1859. I'll read it very quickly. It says, "We cannot be perfectly posted in reference to the claims of our advertisers. This column is set apart for those who desire it, to acquaint the people with their powers, or to notice their wares. Those who are in need of such services or wares must investigate for themselves and not suppose that we endorse any claims herein set forth. We have no time for such investigation, nor is it proper for us to decide for another man what is meant for him. We never advise for any person or business that we know to be dishonest or an imposition upon the public." All that aside, it is in 1859 that there is finally an ad that mentions something tangible related to death. Throughout the month of December, E.D. Stanford and Company have an ad that discusses granite monuments and headstones that you can see here. Now, this got me excited. So far, I had seen efforts to keep people alive via healing mediums, doctors, and healing remedies, and of course, the other mediums who claimed to be able to reach spirits in the afterlife, but this was the first time that I saw anything related to a cemetery. That ad is ran until March of 1860 and then is never seen again, at least in the years that I examined. 1860 is still published in both Boston and New York and does include ads about life insurance, a copy that you can see here on the screen. The ad count in total being 2,957 for the year. The periodical was circulated throughout the US, Canada, and England, so it is understandable why people were eager to place ads with the paper. Now, with the war beginning in 1861, I thought the slow inclusion of these products would continue and hopefully ultimately expand. This paper often spoke about the war and even had an ad that encouraged the formation of an all-spiritualist regiment, which I've included here on the screen for you. And in August 17th, 1861, the ad on the left made its first of 3 appearances. Personalizing monuments of the deceased is a hallmark of the good death. So I was very excited to see its inclusion. 1862 saw a few more instances of death-related goods, like spirit photographs, and Conant agreeing to attend funerals and attempt to speak to the dead, whether there was an actual body present or not. However, the paper hit a slump in ad placements and sales and returned to being only published in Boston by 1863. And I apologize that I have to go quickly so that I take care of everyone's time here. The next tangible death-related ad isn't until 1865. Interestingly, it appears the same day that President Abraham Lincoln died, April 15th, 1865. And it essentially is an ad by Prince and Company in Flushing, New York that is willing to supply shrubs and flowers to help decorate cemetery plots. So let's get to some numbers here. In total, I counted and examined 20,163 advertisements printed from 1857 to 1865. Now, this of course includes reprints of ads because they had to pay every time that they placed an ad. And I've shown you a single copy of every tangible death-related good I found that didn't include mediums or publications about theoretics of what happens after one dies. Interestingly, I never found mention of embalming in the ad section of the paper, which I had expected to find. It is interesting that a periodical as popular and well known for spiritualism rarely, if ever, mentions these things. Instead, it focuses on the still living while still providing a communal outlet for shared grief. The market of mourning is nothing without the living taking part in the system. Therefore, even the act of dying and memorialization is subject to the issue of supply and demand. Previous studies over spiritualism tend to focus on the mediums or the seances themselves, so little work has been done on the economic side of these activities. And even though this study only investigates 9 years of the Banner of Light's publications, it clearly shows a trend in the advertisement section of the paper. When it came to deterring bad death, the paper essentially presented 2 options. The first one being incredibly easy. It meant simply staying alive through healing tonics, hospitals, or health mediums. Or it meant saying your final goodbyes through a medium that can connect loved ones in the living in spirit world through their voice, writings, or drawings. Going forward, I want to examine more volumes, particularly those of the 1880s, and see how spiritualists tried to keep their self-given title as the authority on death and dying. Organizations like the American Medical Association, which is founded in 1847 and incorporated in 1897, desperately tried and arguably succeeded in making spiritualism and its now deemed occult practices less mainstream. One last thing, I would like to thank and acknowledge the International Association for the Preservation of Spiritualist and Occult Periodicals for having the Banner of Light free to access on their website. It has been a tremendous help since traveling for research has been out of the question lately. They have several occult periodicals available, so if you are interested in similar topics, you should definitely check them out at that listed website. And thank you so much for listening. That's all I have.
Thank you so much. I appreciate
Thank you. I apologize for the technical problems at the beginning. Thank you.
It happens. And I'm grateful that you were willing to be the first one out. So whatever technical glitches occurred, unfortunately happened under your presentation. But thank you so much, Lisa. I'm going to move us to our second presentation. Again, if you have any questions for Lisa that popped up while she was speaking, do feel free to put those into the chat and we will acknowledge those in the Q&A session later on. Our next presenter is Sarah Lirley. She is an assistant professor of history at Columbia College in Columbia, Missouri. She specializes in 19th century US history, the history of women and gender, and the history of death and death investigations. She is currently working on a manuscript that I am excited, no pressure, to see in print. It's called An Arc of Death, Suicide, Alcoholism, Murder, Accidents, and Other Early Deaths in St. Louis, Missouri, 1875 to 1885. That project examined 6 different causes of death by interrogating coroners' verdicts and the community's responses to and understanding of those deaths. Her talk today comes from this work and is titled, quote, Not as Simple as Disease, Coroner's Verdicts of Natural Death. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Vicki. And thank you everybody for attending. So excited. Like everybody else said, we're not in Seattle, but this is really, really nice. Thank you. And I don't have a fancy PowerPoint, which is good because I have a technology curse. So just after 6:00 a.m. on September 15th, 1883, Mary Smith knocked on her neighbor's, Kate Williamson's, door. Smith hoped to return Williamson's dog to her, which she had rescued the night before during a fight between Williamson and her lover, Billy McHugh. Hearing no answer to her knock, Smith called out, "Here's your dog," but was still met with silence. Smith knocked once more, then used her key to unlock Williamson's door. She found her neighbor lying on the floor, naked. She called to her again, then tried to wake Williamson, but the woman was dead. Smith found her face to be warm, but her toes and fingers were cold. She became excited, waking Williamson's nephew, who called out, "Mama, Mama," to his aunt, the woman whom he considered to be his mother. Smith went downstairs and alerted another neighbor, Mrs. Casey, who returned to Williamson's rented rooms with Smith. Smith then called the St. Louis City Office of the Coroner, who sent Deputy Coroner George Peck to investigate the unusual and untimely death of Kate Williamson. Deputy Coroner Peck had to determine if the 38-year-old had died from illness, alcoholism, homicide, or, less likely in Williamson's case, suicide. Peck soon learned from Smith and other neighbors that Williamson had fought with her lover the previous night and that Billy McHugh had assaulted Williamson. Police arrested McHugh and held him in jail until Peck could determine whether he had caused Williamson's death by having shoved, punched, and kicked her. Peck examined Williamson's body, interviewed witnesses, and he even ordered an autopsy. Surprisingly, he ultimately determined that Williamson died from natural causes. As with several other cases in this study, however, a close examination of Williamson's death reveals that even natural deaths are more complicated than they initially appear. The lengthy investigation into the death of Kate Williamson, potential criminal charges, and autopsy were all unusual in investigations into natural deaths, that is, deaths caused by illness or disease. Williamson's case is drawn from a larger study of 120 inquests conducted by the St. Louis City Office of the Coroner between 1875 and 1885. Of those 120 inquests, coroners determined 15 to be from natural causes. And of those 15, only 3 featured an initial suspicion of homicide or medical malpractice, including Williamson's. While coroners investigated about 1/5 of these alleged natural deaths as possible homicides, they investigated most of them because they had unknown causes, occurred in public places, or were unattended by a physician as required by Missouri law. In the larger project from which this case is drawn, I argue that by viewing death investigations from 3 social locations, that of the investigating coroner, witnesses in the inquest, and newspaper reporters, it becomes apparent that 3 elements were the most important in investigating and interpreting these deaths. And those factors were whether the deceased had family members who testified on their behalf, whether the coroner believed that it was possible that another person may have caused or contributed to the death, and the reputation of the deceased. In most cases, investigating coroners quickly determined that neither the deceased nor any other person was responsible for these natural deaths. Instead, illness caused them. Coroners investigated most natural deaths quickly, but while brief inquests and verdicts into natural causes of death make them appear simple, some were not. In some cases, the verdicts were inaccurate, reflecting causes of death that conflicted with witness testimony or other evidence given in the case. These inconsistencies suggest that coroners and deputy coroners rushed their investigations. Now, in Williamson's case, in addition to the possibility that her death was a homicide, there were 2 other potential causes. And there are 2 main reasons for this apparent lack of attention to detail in the inquest records of natural deaths. First, coroners did not expect criminal charges to result from their investigations into natural deaths. Unlike homicides and some deaths caused by abortions and accidents, few natural deaths had any evidence that anyone was to blame for them, either the deceased themselves or someone else. Unlike deaths by suicide, burial rights were not at stake. Unlike deaths by homicide, an inquest was not a first step in the criminal justice system. Therefore, inquests into deaths from natural causes had lower stakes. In many cases, an inquest was simply a formality rather than a potential first step toward a criminal trial. Second, a lack of medical expertise sometimes led to verdicts that contradict witness testimony. St. Louis coroners were physicians, but they also held political office. Party loyalty, not medical training, prompted coroners to appoint deputy coroners who often lacked medical knowledge. Of 7 deputy coroners in this study, 4 had expertise in either the medical or legal fields, with 2 working as licensed practicing physicians and 2 working as attorneys when they did not hold office as deputy coroner. Coroners, in contrast, were trained practicing physicians. Deputy coroners regularly investigated deaths and rendered verdicts without direct supervision from coroners, particularly in apparent natural deaths. Now, the death of Kate Williamson is remarkable because there is substantial evidence that she had died from a homicide. In fact, Deputy Coroner Peck initially suspected that injuries caused by an assault from Williamson's lover, Billy McHugh, caused her death between the hours of 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock a.m. on September 15th. Peck interviewed 7 witnesses, several more than the 2 to 4 witnesses whom coroners typically interviewed in deaths that were not suspected homicides. Peck also ordered an autopsy in Williamson's case, another uncommon step. Police also arrested William Billy McHugh because they thought that he had inflicted deadly injuries upon Williamson. McHugh was easy to find. He arrived at Williamson's home shortly after Officer Charles Landers arrived. Landers immediately arrested him while the deputy coroner investigated Williamson's death. Deputy Coroner Peck spoke with Williamson's nephew, 3 of her neighbors, the investigating police officer, and Dr. James C. Neidlet, who completed the autopsy. And his brother was also a coroner for a while in St. Louis. Peck had found no marks on Williamson's body when he examined it, but witness testimony alerted him to a potentially deadly assault. Emily Vincent, Sally Casey, and Mary Smith all told Deputy Coroner Peck that McHugh had shoved and punched Williamson. At one point, McHugh said that he wanted to give Williamson, quote, a good licking, but, quote, did not want to give her any marks, presumably because bruises or cuts would provide evidence that he had assaulted her. Williamson's nephew called a police officer, but he would not arrest McHugh unless she pressed charges, which she refused to do, which was not and is not uncommon in domestic violence situations for a number of reasons. Williamson's neighbors sat with her after the incident and made sure that she closed her windows and locked her door before they went to sleep. The neighbors reluctantly left Williamson after the incident, worrying that McHugh would break into her rented rooms overnight, but they still did not expect to find their friend dead the next morning. McHugh's statement to Williamson's neighbors showed that he felt at least partially responsible for her death. When he arrived at Williamson's home the morning of the inquest, McHugh asked Sally Casey if his lover was, in fact, dead. When she confirmed his suspicions, McHugh cried, saying, quote, "Oh my God, Kate, what have I done to you? But you have no marks," as if he believed that a lack of visible bruises meant that he could not have beaten her to death. His tears were probably for himself and probably not for Williamson, as he expressed concern over facing execution by hanging for her death. He told Casey, quote, "Well, I'll swing, I guess, but they'll hang me innocent." While Williamson's neighbors seemed certain that McHugh had killed Williamson, the evidence from the coroner's inquest proved to be less conclusive. Deputy Coroner Peck considered witness testimony along with the results from Dr. Neidelet's autopsy. Neidelet did not find evidence that McHugh's attack had killed Williamson. Instead, he found that her heart and lungs were congested, and he concluded that these illnesses were, quote, evidently the result of alcoholism. In addition to Neidelet's autopsy results, Deputy Coroner Peck gathered witness testimony that Williamson may have had a habit of drinking to excess. Several neighbors insisted that Williamson drank only beer as opposed to hard liquor, and that they believed that she was not a heavy drinker. Sally Casey remarked that Williamson drank the same amount of beer, quote, that all hardworking women do. Williamson was rather young at 38, but her sister-in-law testified that she had a history of a heart condition. Despite the autopsy results, Deputy Coroner Peck rendered her death as caused by, quote, congestive heart and lung failure with, quote, fluid buildup, perhaps from heart disease. Peck's verdict made no mention of alcoholism nor a physical assault. Once the inquest concluded, police released McHugh from custody. He faced no criminal charges in Williamson's death. While the lengthy inquest into Kate Williamson's death and initial suspicion of homicide was unusual for deaths caused by disease or illness, the complicated nature of her death was not. Despite brief investigations and verdicts that determined that these men and women died from natural causes, some may have died at the hands of others, at least in part. In other cases, they may have died from illnesses that the coroners did not acknowledge in their verdicts, and there are other cases in this chapter where I talk about that. Coroners may not have felt the need to determine an accurate time of death or pinpoint a specific illness with certainty because these men and women died from sicknesses, not homicides. Their verdicts would not implicate or exonerate anyone in most cases. While it was the job of the coroner to determine an accurate cause of death, evidently they felt that their duty was less pressing in these cases. Nonetheless, witness testimony reveals that they were more complicated than their investigations and verdicts made them appear. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Sarah. I'm trying to get good at both doing my emoji reactions there and hosting, but thank you so much. It's so fascinating, and I have a lot of questions about coroners, but I will save those towards the end. All right, so the next speaker on the panel is myself. which is awkward to introduce oneself at talks such as these. I'll just shortly say that my research focuses on the history of death and disaster victim identification in the United States from the Civil War to the Cold War. And my interest is really in not just the technology of identification, but the ways in which a sort of visual culture of identification has shaped our understanding of what it means to identify, as well as the meaning of the corpse in modern American society. So today, my talk is going to be about the General Slocum disaster of 1904, which took place in New York City. Can everyone see my slides here?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. So in my work on the history of disaster victim identification, also known as DVI, I trace the change in practice from site recognition to forensic identification. In the past, those killed in mass fatality events would have been recovered to a centralized location and viewed by the public, who would recognize the body or the personal effects found with that body. To me, this method was very dependent on the family or friends of the dead, and its public nature is quite different from today's forensic practice, which is often performed by trained scientific experts working behind closed doors. Today, as I said, I want to talk about the General Slocum steamship disaster in New York City from 1904 in order to explore how American DVI evolved from site recognition to forensic identification. This evolution has not been linear and was not always driven by actors who are consciously enacting change. Not until the 1940s do we start to see people sort of actively looking at DVI as a scientific practice that had its own sort of codes and systems to be communicated to others around the country. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, changes that occurred to disaster victim identification were often shaped by the available resources used by individuals who are making decisions under high pressure situations. At the same time, though, these decisions reflect what I see as an incremental intervention of the state into the DVI process. So the General Slocum case signals the emergence of a new kind of disaster identification paradigm in which state officials began to play a more significant role than before. Now, this was due in large part to the fact that the disaster took place in New York City, where progressive bureaucrats trained to target urban problems applied rational systems of counting and documentation to mass death. At the Slocum disaster, the bodies of the dead were markers of disorder, bodies out of place, both materially and symbolically. The corpses floating in the river or caught in the wreckage of the ship undermined traditional mourning customs and the normal functions of the city. To restore order, the city temporarily scaled up its normal death management practices, and in doing so, exerted state control into disaster identification. So in examining the city's response, I argue that we can see how the bureaucrats' ability to control, create, and circulate the visual culture of identification allowed them to restore order on the chaos generated by mass death. And so for the remainder of my time today, I want to talk very briefly about what the General Slocum disaster was, and then address 3 examples of this visual culture. First, how the city controlled viewings of the dead bodies. Second, how they used victim photography. And third, the creation of data tables that allowed the city to sort of re-visualize or re-see the identifications. As a quick note, there are 1 or 2 graphic images in my presentation today, and I'll do my best to give you a heads up about that, so you can choose to look away if you need to. So what is the General Slocum disaster? The disaster occurred on the morning of June 15, 1904. Members of Little Germany's St. Mark's Church had hired the passenger ship, the General Slocum, for an annual summer excursion to Long Island. But less than an hour after leaving the docks in Lower Manhattan, a fire broke out on the lower deck of the ship. Despite having passed a fire inspection in the previous month, the ship's fire hoses were broken and useless. Soon the boat was engulfed in flames, and panicked passengers began jumping into the East River, despite being unable to swim. Some put on life vests, only to discover that the desiccated cork inside of them absorbed water. Those who tried to retrieve the ship's lifeboats found them secured by wire. Several boatmen near the Slocum appeared and pulled victims from the water, while people on nearby North Brother Island ran to administer aid to the victims that were washing up on shore. The Slocum's dramatic final minutes provided a horrifying spectacle before the ship finally ran aground on the north side of North Brother Island. Of the 1,358 people aboard the General Slocum that morning, an estimated 1,021 died. This volume of death required a full-scale city response involving several municipal departments. However, the two departments overseeing the bodies were the Department of Health and the Coroner's Office. As the number of recovered bodies began to increase, the Health Commissioner, Thomas Darlington, designated the Department of Charities Pier at East 26th Street as a temporary morgue, placing the dead under the care of Manhattan coroner Gustav Schuller. Now, after the General Slocum fire, the city's primary role in the identifications was to facilitate site recognition. Employees from various municipal departments brought the bodies to the Department of Charities Pier and laid them out as you see here. As a city-owned space, the pier allowed Coroner Schuller and his colleagues to manage how and when site recognition occurred. Although identification was still to be performed by the family and friends of the dead, these identifiers were at the mercy of the city. Charities Pier would be guarded by a team of 50 police patrolmen who had to contend with both distraught individuals seeking a loved one and spectators seeking a thrill. In fact, it was concern that the bodies would become a public spectacle that led to this increased police presence. While no exact count has been made, newspapers at the time estimated that tens of thousands of people came through the morgue, an unknown number of those curiosity seekers. The crowd of genuine mourners outside the morgue oscillated between shocked silence and agitation, especially because Health Commissioner Darlington closed the morgue several times to allow for the preparation of the bodies for viewing. The first closure was on the night of June 15th, the date of the disaster, when local undertakers worked all night to embalm the remains on hand. The morgue closed at least 2 more times when new loads of bodies arrived at the pier, and each closure provoked anguish in the crowd, threatening to turn the mourners into a mob. Quote, "The throng, wrought to the limit of nerve tension by the horrors of the disaster and driven off the pier when a fresh boatload of bodies arrived, broke through the line of bluecoats and hurled themselves into the temporary morgue. Twice, the policemen, reforming their line, drove out the throng as gently as possible." These repeated openings and closings of the morgue, while necessary to properly count, embalm, and lay out the dead for viewing, nonetheless demonstrated the state's desire to support site recognition, provided that it unfolded in an orderly manner. The city's municipal officials also decided when site recognition was no longer possible. By June 21st, city officials began to embalm fewer bodies, claiming, quote, "The stage is past where identification is to be hoped for." While this decision likely indicates the poor condition of the remains 6 days after death, it also reflects that the city, not the families, decided how and when site recognition could happen. Now, more significant than the management of the morgues was the city's decision to photograph the victims. Local photographers appear to have been called in by the city's police commissioner, William McAdoo. Now, the slide I'm about to show you is a compilation of some of those victim photographs, and the bodies do not look in great condition. So if you're squeamish or choose not to look, just wanted to give you a heads up. As these photographs from North Brother Island show, workers either laid out groups of bodies organized by gender and age, or photographed bodies individually. These photographs are fascinating for several reasons, and I would be more than happy to talk about them at greater length in the Q&A. But for now, I'll point out that the inconsistency in the formatting or composition of the photographs, to me, suggests the somewhat ad hoc nature of the photography work. But despite these compositional inconsistencies, the city did hope that they would be useful for identification after the bodies had been buried. Police Commissioner McAdoo intended to circulate the pictures amongst the Little Germany community and then hold onto them at his police station. Now, photographing the dead, of course, had precedent in New York City at Bellevue Hospital morgue, which had started the practice shortly after the morgue opened in the 1860s. However, for me, it's worth noting that it was the police commissioner, not the health commissioner nor the coroner, who called in the photographers. This suggests a different precedent for these images, which would be the criminal photograph. The New York Police Department was one of the first in the country to create what they called a rogues gallery, which you see on the right, developed in the mid-19th century as a means of displaying photographs of notorious criminals so officers could become acquainted with their faces. In 1904 alone, the New York Police Department made over 9,000 such photographs. These photographs were on display in the police station, and the public was also invited to look at them, providing a model for public photographic display before the Slocum disaster. The display of disaster victim photographs suggests that, like criminals, these disaster dead were understood as a challenge to the civic order. Of course, the nature of that's presented by the criminal is different than that of the disaster victim. And certainly the display of the victim photographs was not intended to shame the Slocum victims. In both cases, however, we see the city attempting to use the increasingly powerful tool of photography to fix the body, whether fleeing or decomposing. What's more, as with the temporary morgue at Charities Pier, police could determine who had access to the photographs, again, exerting control over the visual culture of the identification process. Finally, the bureaucratic impulses embedded in the city's support of site recognition are best demonstrated in the post-disaster record management performed by the Department of Charities and the city's Commissioner of Accounts. The effort to clarify the record of the disaster was emblematic of the city's larger death bureaucracy, which was initially rooted in public health efforts to track mortality. After the General Slocum disaster, this urban death bureaucracy allowed the city to gather large quantities of data generated by the identification process and represent that data in new ways to essentially re-visualize identification in tables and charts. And in doing so, to offer another means of identifying the dead beyond recognition. To begin, the city accountants set out to create an official list of all the victims and survivors. They collected information from the various municipal departments involved in the Slocum response and corrected any discrepancies they found. This official data then appeared in the Department of Charities annual report for 1905. In the published report, the identified victims were listed alphabetically, along with age, address, and place of birth. The list of the missing, however, was organized into a comparative table, like you see here, that aligned names with unidentified bodies. So on the left side of the table, the image on the left, the missing individuals are listed by age. On the right, unidentified bodies are listed by estimated age. There is an apparent attempt to link known decedents with bodies of a corresponding age, thereby creating a possible link between victims and bodies. So for example, victim Kate Schaefer, 6 years old at the time of her death, is listed in line with body number 831, estimated by the coroner to be 7 years old. Other than age and sex, however, it's unclear what other data was used to make these alignments. As you can possibly see, I know the writing is quite small, but these tables contain numerous unidentified bodies that all roughly correspond in age with several of the missing dead. Nonetheless, the identifications that are suggested by the visual alignment of victim and body in these tables may have helped narrow options for families who could then disinter remains from the Lutheran cemetery in order to confirm whether the suspected body was in fact the person they were seeking. As you can see on the right, the table in the annual report also provides the exact location in the Lutheran cemetery by row and grave number where each body was interred. The Department of Charities also provided a map of the Lutheran cemetery interments, noting the position and number of each coffin. A copy of these drawings were held at the cemetery, and records indicate that in the 2 months after the disaster, families identified 37 bodies after disinterment, possibly with the assistance of these charts. So these three practices, managing visual access of the dead, photographing them, using data to suggest potential identifications, ultimately struck a balance between the need to help the affected community of mourners and to provide for the city's need to respond to the disaster with bureaucratic order. While the families and friends of the victims still had ultimate authority after this disaster to name their dead, New York officials were able to offer tools that extended the limits of traditional site recognition. These tools shaped how site recognition unfolded and, I think, foreshadowed later DVI systems in which expert authority would ultimately prevail over the dead. Thank you. Great. Okay. And so I will somewhat awkwardly transition back into moderator mode to present our final panelist for today. Our final panelist is Aelwen Wetherby. She works for a company called SNA International, who then supports the U.S. Defense POW MIA accounting agency in their efforts to identify the unidentified remains from World War II and the Korean War. So her historical research for the DPAA has examined the history of unknowns recovered from Asia and the Pacific, shedding light on the challenges faced by the American Graves Registration Service in the 1940s and 1950s. In addition to this work, Dr. Wetherby also teaches periodically at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, covering topics in the history of medicine and technology. Her talk today is The Remains of War, Questions of Authority, Expertise, and Ownership in U.S. Army Identification Efforts of World War II. Aelwen.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's see. I'm going to pull up my slides, hopefully. Can everyone see those? Awesome.
Yes,
okay.
we can.
I'm just going to set a timer too, because I don't want to run over. So today, I am going to be talking a little bit about AGRS identification efforts during World War II. And in so doing, I want to give kind of a brief orientation to that for those who are not familiar with the AGRS. And then I'm going to kind of frame the rest of my discussion around a particular film that the War Department released in 1946 called Decision. And in this film, I'm really interested in complications to the way in which a transfer of ownership almost occurred with an identification. So obviously with World War II casualties, much of the process of identification and that kind of root processing of the dead is managed by the military, by the government. But as those remains are returned to the families, I argue there is that shift right, in ownership and expertise. But it's not always as simple as maybe decision the film makes it out to be. So I want to spend a little time to explore that and particularly wrap up with some of the gender dimensions that I think emerge through the film and some of the examples that I will bring up. So the American Graves Registration Service, this is a branch of the Memorial Division of the Quartermaster General of the US Army, and it is tasked with the process of recovering and identifying all casualties from World War II. And it had a precedent before the Second World War, but certainly in World War II, it's facing a scale of a task that it has never before seen. So in the aftermath of the war, AGRS personnel were involved in processing over 300,000 sets of human remains, including many that were initially recovered as unidentified. The identification efforts were carried out largely in scientific spaces like we see here in this image. This is actually the AGRS Central Identification Laboratory that was stationed at Schofield Barracks in Oahu in the late 1940s. And it's worth noting as well that identification efforts were really largely successful. So over 97% of the remains that were kind of questioned in terms of identification were ultimately identified and returned to their families. But again, in this short discussion today, I am especially interested in the complications to that relationship, that transfer of ownership, because ultimately identification, I argue, marks more than a scientific accomplishment in confirming a serviceman's fate. It marks this transfer of both a body and a story from the government to the family. So, I mentioned already that in 1946, the War Department releases a short film titled Decision, which I want to bring up today that through its characters and assertions, reveals an interesting narrative about these potential complications to that pivotal moment, marking the return of remains to the family of a deceased serviceman. Potential complications that the War Department was also, I would argue, clearly aware of and concerned with, as illustrated by the film. The film itself is about 15 minutes long, so I'm not going to be able to show all of it, but I can't help but want to share a few short clips. So hopefully they will not make me run over time. Just to provide a little bit of a lead in to our first clip, the film opens to a pastoral setting, panning to neat rows of graves of a national cemetery. And in so doing, it explains the policy set by US Congress that, quote unquote, has made it possible for the next of kin to decide where final burial of the war dead shall be made. And this is the central decision referenced in that film's title, a decision resting with the family of a serviceman. Now, while this freedom of choice may not seem so unusual to us today, this is actually a relatively new phenomenon for the period in terms of war casualties. And certainly relative to other countries that were involved in the Second World War. We had a similar precedent set in World War I as in other previous wars, but again, the Quartermaster Service had never faced an undertaking at the scale required for World War II. So after outlining the responsibilities of the Memorial Division, the film takes us into the home of a young woman widowed in the war. And we'll go ahead to our first clip.
Anything wrong, Martha? Oh, this letter came from the War Department, Mother. Oh? They're asking me where I want Jimmy's body finally buried. I can select a cemetery at home or overseas. What are you going to do? I don't know, Mother. What do you think I should do? Well, dear, I'm not the one to decide that. You see, you're the next of kin, and the decision rests with you. Now, if Jimmy hadn't married, then the responsibility would have been mine, since Jimmy's father is not living. I see. Give it some thought. Yes, Mother.
So this very brief clip highlights one of the initial challenges faced in this transfer of ownership, and that is the determination of a primary next of kin. Now, the fact that this film chooses to portray this initial relationship between the wife of a serviceman and a serviceman's mother, I believe is no accident, as we see in casualty records, not infrequently, that there are occasionally conflicts between different family members regarding who should actually have that decision-making authority. Unfortunately, and I would repeat this throughout, I don't have statistics yet on all of the several 100,000 World War II dead, but I can say that there are definitely repeated instances where we see a mother writing to the War Department saying, you know, the wife of my son is no longer in the picture, she's remarried, I should be the one to decide, not her, even though she had taken precedent, as we see illustrated in this one vignette. And these are records that most often can be found in a serviceman's individual casualty records that describe the circumstances of his death, as well as incorporate this sort of correspondence with family members. Now, as the widow of our fictional soldier grapples with her decision, the film next introduces the family's milkman, Henry, who conveniently happens to be incredibly knowledgeable about the Memorial Division's policies and procedures in arranging a serviceman's final burial. Most of Henry's discussion with Mrs. Atkinson focuses on the War Department's determination of next of kin, a clear priority for this film, as well as the types of cemeteries that could be considered by a family for selecting as a burial location. But almost as an aside, he introduces another theme that I want to discuss today.
It also tells you about national cemeteries in this country. I saw one on Long Island. Not much difference between the national cemetery here and the military ones overseas, except the ones over here are closer to the Statue of Liberty. If that's the kind of a cemetery you want, all you have to do is to ask for it. Oh, by the way, according to Bill McDonald, all the remains are positively identified before the Quartermaster General sends out a letter. In other words, if the War Department tells you that the body of a soldier is Private John Smith, then you can rest assured it is Private John Smith. There's absolutely no chance of a slip-up.
I think a lot of people will be relieved to hear that. Indeed, they will.
So again, even solely looking at cases where we know that this was not true and happened to make the news, we know that in spite of the overwhelming success of the AGRS in their identification efforts, some mistakes were made and some identifications were rejected by families, whether rightly or wrongly. And I find all this especially interesting in the wake of Vicki's discussion, where we really see that exclusion of the family from this sort of initial identification process, right? This has since moved on into the realm of scientific experts. Ultimately, these sorts of controversies over an identification are definitely the minority. They are a small percentage of all of those to come out of AGRS efforts, but they're not without significance. I think these are out of order. So as examples, I've pulled a few headlines that appeared in both local and national news sources in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And many of these mistakes could be linked to the individual's circumstances of loss, usually involving some sort of incident in which multiple individuals were killed at once, perhaps through a bombing incident or aircraft crash. And many times the Memorial Division would work through such complications with the possibility of a group identification. But whenever possible, an effort was made to identify servicemen individually. Now, with remains that might be commingled or fragmentary due to the nature of the loss, dentition often provided the most reliable scientific method available at the time. But what is interesting to me beyond these sorts of identification practices rooted in the science of the day is just how many of these exceptions to AGRS success and identification or complications to that process seem to be presented publicly in these newspaper articles in relation to a female member of the victim's family, most often, it seems, the mother. In other words, articles like these and references in casualty records as well, often place these discrepancies or disagreements between the War Department and a female family member of the victim, whether mother, sister, or wife. Now, the small sampling of articles that I have, I selected kind of to highlight two sides of this controversy. In this case, these are articles describing the case of a mistaken identity, a mistake that the government made and admitted to making in the 1940s, notifying the family of the mistake and returning in both of these cases a new set of remains and taking away the remains that they had initially identified as the servicemen. In the first instance, we see in the upper left-hand corner, 2 years after returning a set of remains to the family of Second Lieutenant J.M. Ackridge, the War Department reached out to the family reporting that there had been a mistake. This case is unique because the air loss he was associated with actually took place on US soil. And as described in some of the articles about this incident, the mother of Second Lieutenant Ackridge actually was called upon to confirm the identity of this second set of remains that was found. Obviously, this sort of family participation was usually not possible due to the fact that we're dealing with war casualties that occurred all over the world. Meanwhile, in the other two articles I've pulled here, we see in these two headlines that are referring to an initial misidentification of a set of remains as Sergeant Leonard J. Moynihan, who died in the Dutch East Indies in 1945. Almost every article I found, and these are not the only ones, highlight the mother's role as the recipient and perhaps even on some level the victim in this mix-up. Now, on the other side of this kind of controversy over identification, I did pull a couple of articles relating to cases of the rejection by a family of an identification. And these two articles that I pulled are actually related to the same incident in which the mother of Private Stephen J. Lautenbach, who died in France in 1944, was convinced that the body reported by the AGRS to be that of her son was not him, and that her son was in fact still alive and probably suffering from amnesia somewhere in Europe. Now, she actually went to the length of hiring a lawyer to argue her case, and this particular story seems to have made national news. You can find it in papers all over the country in the late 1940s. But ultimately, the evidence that the War Department could present seems to have been overwhelming. You see kind of highlighted in one of these articles a chance of many, many millions based on the dentition that was present. There were also witnesses who described seeing him die on the battlefield. And some of the photographic evidence of POWs that she was arguing were evidence that her son was still alive was also dismissed when they were able to find the surviving members who were actually represented in those photographs. There are other examples as well, even though this one, the ID was ultimately made, in which the resistance of a family member actually led to an ID being overturned. So although it didn't make the national news, a sister, when notified of the identification of her brother from a set of remains recovered in association with one of the POW hell ships, called the Anaramaru, she said it couldn't possibly be him because she had spoken to other survivors from the incident who said that he had a different date of death than the War Department had reported. Not uncommon given the nature of the incident, but ultimately her evidence that she had found through other surviving members of this incident led the War Department to rescind the identification and accept the new date of death. Once again, this sort of resistance was being led by a female family member. So jumping back, since my slides are out of order, I have one more example of kind of a complication that I want to share.
How do you do? My name is Thomas. Are you the widow of Sergeant James Atkinson?
Yes, I am.
I'm here to help you, Mrs. Atkinson. You're probably aware of the fact that your husband's body can be returned to this country for burial.
Yes.
Well, I'm in a position to make all arrangements for you. I have numerous contacts in France, and for a nominal cost, say $60, you can put everything in my hands.
Well,
Now, Mrs. Atkinson, if I ask for $50, it's just to defray expenses. I ask nothing for myself. I deem it a patriotic
I
duty.
think that's very kind of you. Only,
She's not going to pay, mister. And what's more, she doesn't need your help.
Just who are you?
A friend.
I don't like the way you talk, young man.
That goes double for me. Why, you're just a racketeer trying to cash in on the sorrow of mothers and wives and everybody else who's lost somebody in the war. Well, you're barking around the wrong door. The War Department arranges everything, get it? Everything, without cost. And the best contact any next of kin can have is the Quartermaster General in Washington.
I didn't mean any harm.
Not much you didn't. Now beat it, scram. And don't try to cash in around here or any other place.
So I include this because I think it's a great example to kind of end with in the way in which this film seems to seek out to really define the territory of the War Department in navigating this relationship between the family and the government. Now, I also think looking at these three clips together, there's a really interesting story about gender. So again and again, the few examples that I've shared today illustrate the way in which disagreements surrounding the identification of remains or the disposition of a body are largely presented in the film and in the articles that I shared as revolving around women related in some way to the servicemen. And as illustrated in the newspaper articles in particular, the mother especially plays a pivotal role. Now, in many ways, this could perhaps come as no surprise. It's understandable from a very human level, the unique investment a mother in particular might have in the death of a son in war. But one could also argue that it fits into a larger wave of activism of mothers that began in World War I and was carried forward into World War II. Organizations such as the American War Mothers, founded in 1917, and American Gold Star Mothers, founded in 1928, not only emerged in the wake of the First World War, but also received special recognition as private organizations receiving congressional charters from the government. Yet another organization, the Blue Star Mothers of America, would follow in World War II along a similar trajectory. But the role of women in these instances is also striking when considered in relation to the process of identification that was occurring at the same time, a process that fell under an arguably more masculine domain with its connections to a male-dominated scientific community and military structure. The film I shared with you today is, I believe, a fantastic illustration of the centrality of the role of women in decisions about the deceased, even if perhaps the War Department didn't really intend that to be the main driving educational point of their video. But it also suggested that it was still a relationship whose terms were to be set by men, as portrayed in Milkman Henry's defense of Mrs. Atkinson in our final scene. It could be argued, however, that perhaps women held a little more power than even this film suggested. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Aelwen. That film, we have to have a whole second follow-up conference about that film. That it's such a fantastic, fantastic source. Great, well, thank you for those of you who are here with us. We are at the end of our panel presentation, and we are more than welcome to open it up for questions from folks. If you would prefer to just put a question in the chat, you're welcome to do that. You're also welcome to unmute yourself to ask your question directly. I'm going to go ahead and take panelist chair prerogative to respond to one question that came in about my talk regarding the bodies that were being stored at the pier in New York City, and the question of whether they were kept cool, embalmed, etc. Especially because it was June, middle of June in New York City. Obviously, preservation of the remains was a huge issue. And if I'd had a little more time for my presentation, I would have talked about the embalming efforts that the city of New York undertook to actually help preserve some of those remains for a little bit longer. The city did initially use ice, which was available in the summer months, but they soon called on local undertakers to come in and help do embalmings on the remains, and spent quite a bit of money, several $1,000s in contemporary money to pay these undertakers to do that work. So it was very much a consideration, and I would argue that the embalming was yet another kind of intervention into the visual culture of identification by using this technology from the funeral industry, applying it to these victims. The city was able to exert further control on the body's sort of biological state and allowed those bodies to be visible for a longer period of time in order for site recognition to happen. Great, so I see one hand was raised by Michelle Cornell. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I would. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. My question is for you, Dr. Daniels. Thank you to all the panelists. Excellent, excellent research. My question is for the Slocum disaster. Was this the way that they used the methodology in working to identify the victims? Was this kind of the first of its kind in using those strategies? Or do you see other incidents informing this one and how they were working about the problem? Or is this kind of the first of its type that's actually launching further into creating a method for identifying mass casualty remains? Thank you.
Sure. So it's of course a complicated answer. As I said in my talk, I don't really see a lot of direct connections between various disaster events in terms of thinking about DVI as a sort of set of standardized practices or protocols. And so I think in the case of the General Slocum, I think a lot of the response there in particular was really just scaling up some of these practices and systems that were already in place. And New York had had a city morgue since the 1860s. They had coroner's offices. They had started to incorporate death certificates and other kinds of sort of record keeping on mortality statistics and those things. And I think that because this disaster was in New York City, they had both those systems in place and a city with enough resources to put towards the identification to scale up. So in earlier disasters, you might see attempts at creating a very orderly site recognition process, but there's a lot more, I think, inconsistency or informality to those efforts compared to what happens in New York in 1904. Going forward, I don't see a lot of sort of that smoking gun evidence where people say, well, this is what we did after the Slocum fire, so therefore we need to do X, Y, Z. But there are a couple of things that are of note, I think, in response to this question. In addition to the photographs that I showed you, there was also a photographer who was called into North Brother Island by the Bronx coroner, who not only took photographs of bodies, but also took photographs of people working on the island to recover and to prepare the bodies. And I've always wanted to know if the coroner called in this photographer to sort of document what they were doing. Was there any kind of impulse in that to think maybe those photographs could be used to help better develop disaster response in the city? But I don't have any records to indicate that that was a conscious decision that that particular individual was making to use photography to maybe sort of create that record of best practices, essentially. The only other time I see a lot of reference back to Slocum is actually in the rise of identification science, specifically around fingerprinting. Advocates who want fingerprinting to become a national practice, they want Americans to all be fingerprinted, will sometimes point to the Slocum disaster to say, look at how hard that was to identify all those people. If we only had a national register of fingerprints, we'd be able to identify disaster victims so much more quickly. So there's these little glimmers of sort of threads, if you will, but I don't think there's, again, that active attempt to draw from lessons from the Slocum in a way that we would recognize today as a kind of building of best practices. There's also a question in the chat about how this compares to the Triangle fire. I do think that because the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 happened 7 years after Slocum, there are some people who have clear memory of the earlier disaster. They actually used the exact same pier in New York for the bodies of the Triangle victims that they did for the Slocum victims. And they even say, let's use that one because it was a valuable space for us previously. So I do think those two disasters probably do have some element of that overlap in terms of similar actors making sort of informed decisions. And then beyond that, again, less of a kind of active building of protocol. It was a long answer, but thank you for your question. Other questions from our viewers? It's also open to other panelists if you all wanted to raise questions with one another.
I actually have a question for Sarah. I thought your discussion about the coroner's sort of political dimensions was really interesting. And I'm kind of curious in learning more about some of the deputy coroners you've come across that didn't have that medical expertise. Like, can you tell like why they were brought on board, or did it really just seem purely political? Like, did they have some other sort of expertise that they were using to claim that role, or what?
So I'm not exactly sure other than party loyalty, but one of the more interesting coroners, and actually one of the more thorough investigators who was a deputy coroner, he was a plumber. He becomes deputy coroner, but later he becomes a judge. So I think it was a path to him to study the law. And so I have 7 deputy coroners. 2 were physicians, 2 did work in the law, but the others, I have one who was a plumber. I can't remember off the top of my head what the other 2 did. But using the census records and city directories and whatever biographical data I can find, I'm trying to kind of piece that together. I'm guessing, they had connections, they knew their friends or whatever, or in this case, and this was Deputy Coroner Thomas Hennessy, I think that maybe it was a stepping stone for him. It's a fascinating, who has that career trajectory, right? Plumber, deputy coroner, judge. I mean,
the American dream.
Exactly, it is. And he did a really good job for the most part. But it is, you do see when coroner gets elected, all the positions change, much like other political positions, and they did run for office. So superintendent of the morgue was also an appointed position, the stenographer, that sort of thing. So I don't have the concrete answers, but I have like an educated guess, connections, party loyalty.
I sort of had a similar question because in my own work, obviously I deal with some coroners who are put into these horrible situations where, regardless of their training, right, they have to respond to these events. And in reading about coroners, I feel like in a lot of the historiography, you kind of get that slightly smirky, like, oh, those corrupt coroners, like they didn't have medical training, they were just there because of political appointments. And you hear a lot about the New York coroners who would, for the right amount of money, might cover up a suicide or an abortion death or something like that. But given that you have looked carefully at this kind of group of coroners, it's a hard question, but where do you think that line is between sort of a cynical, like, oh, they were just these political appointees versus, they took the job seriously, and once they were in that position, they did actually want to pursue truth or whatever kind of other values in their work?
So St. Louis is really unique in that the coroners are trained practicing physicians. So they are trained for their jobs. There's a lot of criticism in Missouri saying, oh, we need medical examiners, but in St. Louis, they have training and they do generally seem to take their jobs seriously. And I focus less on political corruption and more on when they're looking, I look at the, how do they decide, for instance, this person died by suicide as opposed to something else? And now cover-ups, again, those records aren't going to be there, but it was actually pretty hard to cover up a suicide. I do have a case from my master's thesis where the family tried to cover it up. Somebody called the coroner comes in, and there's one coroner, I have a whole chapter and actually an article about death by abortion. One coroner was determined to make sure that these abortionists, as they were called, were held accountable. And there were cover-ups. Other physicians would say, oh, this wealthy woman died of consumption. But if the coroner even got wind, he would come in and investigate. So I find it's more complex. I do have some cynicism. I mean, you can see, for instance, I have yet to investigate the death of a woman who was a sex worker, what they called a prostitute, who they investigated her death at any length. They almost always died by suicide, even if perhaps there were other possible causes. But they do also, I can see where they go to great lengths, such as in the Kate Williamson case, they go to great lengths to try to, they take it seriously that her boyfriend might have killed her.
Mm-hmm. I'm keeping an eye on the time here. There's one question for Lisa that I'd like to direct you to, and then an earlier question that I think would be a good wrap-up question about sort of new directions for death studies. So I'm going to point us first towards Michelle's question for Lisa about your decision to focus on the advertisements in the Banner of Light.
Sure. Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So as I kind of hinted to and said in my talk, the Banner of Light manages to stay in business for 50 years, from 1857 to 1907. And I don't know how many of you look into periodicals during this period, but that's actually quite something, whether it be a spiritualist newspaper or kind of a generalized publication. And so that the fact that they're able, even though by their own admission that they have trouble making printing cost and doing all these other things, that's kind of what first made me sort of look at it. The fact that it just, existed. The fact that it has that pre-war, active war, and although I didn't get to talk about it, the post-war context is also something that's very interesting. The reason why I chose to focus on the advertisement section was actually, it points to your question about whether or not it's kind of unique to there itself or falls in line with the tone that's presented throughout the paper. They actually kind of allow for a bit of a divergence. A lot of the paper either deals with the messenger or the message that Mrs. Conant gives, where she'll give her, essentially it's a transcript of those public seances that she would hold. And it's all very intangible, right? And a lot of the publications that they also promote, again, talk about these intangible things. The ads that I presented to you today are those actual, what we typically think of when we think of death-related goods. And the fact that we see them there is telling in its own way. Admittedly, they do not appear as often as I thought they would, especially given the war. But the fact that most of the bodies did not return home, I think plays a role in that they're not more commonly seen. I'm predicting that that's going to change when I get closer to 1900, when they're starting to compete with, trade journals selling caskets and other things, and, organizations like the American Medical Association trying to disprove and say, you don't need midwives, you need doctors, and other things like that. So that's a really great question, and I hope that I answered it in some kind of intelligible way.
And I see, Aelwen, you also got a question. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that as well before we wrap up.
Yeah, so for anyone not seeing the chat, the question was that the War Department assures viewers of the correct identification of remains, but you show evidence in newspapers of misidentifications. And do your sources explore how families reacted to this, and what did the War Department do to correct it? And my apologies if you hear a dog whining. My terrier is wanting attention right now. This is a really great series of questions, though. what's interesting actually, when you pose that question, and I think back to the articles, is that the articles I shared and some of the others related to the same incidents where there had been a misidentification, the government notified the family, a second set of remains was returned. The articles really don't cover the response of the family at all. I mean, the mother is highlighted in all as kind of being the one who receives these remains, and in the one case confirms the identity, but there's no, kind of emotional dimension to how the family might have responded otherwise. I do think that there's going to be an element of that would differ if, for instance, a family had been notified of a misidentification and did not have the correct set of remains returned, right? Because in the end, at the end of those misidentifications, there was still a body returned to the family and buried according to the family's wishes. But yeah, definitely a good question. What did War Department do to correct it? Yeah, I mean, again, it's notifying the family, and it seems like most often the misidentifications that you come across these articles about and evidence of in the 1940s, where the government realizes a mistake is made, occur when you actually find a second set of remains to disprove the first identification. So there's still this sort of burden of proof scientifically, and it's possible that there were other misidentifications that, because there wasn't the correct set of remains found, that was never caught. Again, probably the minority, certainly the minority, but part of this notification effort that certainly the Army was involved with, whether it's coincidence that they were all Army servicemen in the examples I provided, I don't know. Obviously the Army had this unique role in terms of how they were in control of the AGRS for all the services, right? AGRS dealt with remains from all services during the war. So sort of a long-winded circuitous response, but hopefully addressed it.
Thank you all. I think our final question, as I said, is a nice way to wrap up our panel today. Madeline, I believe, asked whether what the new directions for death studies will be. Where do we think it's going, and what is most exciting? I know big questions are hard. I would certainly say, to sort of maybe offer a somewhat obvious answer, I think that looking more at the various kind of cultural and ethnic practices in our history of death is really important. I know Sarah and I both have connections to the Collective for Radical Death Studies, which is an online group founded by Dr. Cami Fletcher, who is very interested in decentering whiteness from death studies in general. So certainly there's a lot more that we still haven't really explored about, when we sort of think about death studies and American practices. I find that term so multifaceted and so complicated. So I think there's a lot that we still need to do in terms of understanding the histories and cultures of various groups in the United States.
Building on that, the collective has done a lot of work since the COVID-19 pandemic has begun to complicate that. How is grief different based on different communities? One example I'm thinking of is a lot of people cannot grieve the way they used to. They can't, for instance, have a large funeral, but one of the members of the collective pointed out that undocumented families have had to grieve separately on phones for quite some time. So I think that offering, we're experiencing death on a horrific scale, and connecting back to Drew Gilpin Faust's work, right? She talks about how the Civil War changes that understanding of death and grief, but even that is complicated. It varies by race, class, gender, all these elements of one's identity and culture.
Mm-hmm. Lisa or Aelwen, did you want to chime in?
I guess I can. At least last semester, I taught a course over kind of the history of American death culture in the United States. And I kind of ended on where we are going. And, you know, if you're familiar with areas in the forbidden death paradigm, whether you fall into that or not, there is, you know, other options about death becoming spectacular or performative now in the 21st century. And so the fact that now I recently, unfortunately, had to watch a live stream of a funeral of a family friend that died from COVID. And so that the fact that now death is not something that's forbidden or hidden away, and it is very much in the public sphere, whether that be through news broadcast or live streamings of funerals, I think that that's going to play a big role in kind of the American consciousness of what death is and how we react to it.
I don't know that I really have anything very intelligent to add because I probably feel the least connected with sort of academic death studies out of any of my wonderful fellow panelists. But I do think it's really encouraging that there are other people looking at these because from the kind of position that I am working from, given the nature of my work, I think these are really important questions. I think looking at remains themselves, looking at some of these dimensions that so often seem overlooked in other histories. I mean, for instance, World War II histories, they really don't talk about remains processing, even in descriptions of battles, and the casualty numbers that can be reported in a lot of those sources can be all over the map because there's this effort to kind of focus on other aspects because death is hard. It's a difficult topic. And I think, even my background in the history of science and medicine, there's also a tendency to try to focus more on the living and kind of all the processes preceding death, but death is a part of life. So I'm encouraged that it seems that there is more attention being paid to it, and certainly excited by my colleagues' work. But yeah, I am least connected probably when it comes to the real academic world of it.
Well, I'm just so grateful to my fellow panelists for agreeing to do a panel together in the first place and then being game for trying this virtual AHA panel. I really, again, want to thank all of you who took time out of your Thursday afternoons to join us and for the questions that you asked. I think I speak for everyone that if you had any follow-up questions or wanted to communicate further with us, we are all welcoming to emails. Some of us are on Twitter and other realms of the ether that exists on social media. But again, just thank you all for being here. Thank you, Aelwen's dog, for making a last minute appearance, and everyone stay safe, stay healthy. Okay, goodbye.